What happens when Hollywood's most respected actress meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Scarlett Johansson sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to find herself trapped in a verbal minefield that would end with one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two powerhouses clash in ways nobody saw coming. The atmosphere in Studio 57 felt different from the moment Scarlett Johansson walked onto the set. Usually, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert maintains its signature blend of political humor and celebrity charm. But tonight, there was an undercurrent of tension that even the studio audience seemed to sense. Johansson, dressed in an elegant black blazer and looking every bit the A-list star, settled into the guest chair with her usual poise. But those familiar with her body language could detect something guarded in her posture. Colbert opened with his trademark grin, but seasoned. Viewers might have noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome back to the show, Scarlett. Always a pleasure to have you here." His tone carried the practiced warmth of a veteran host, but there was something calculating beneath the surface, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Thanks for having me, Stephen," Johansson replied, her smile equally measured. She crossed her legs and leaned back slightly, a subtle defensive positioning that suggested she was already preparing for something. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Colbert asked about her latest film, a sci-fi thriller that had been generating Oscar buzz. Johansson answered with the kind of polished responses that come from years of media training, discussing her character's complexity and the challenges of the demanding physical role. But even during these seemingly innocuous exchanges, there were micro-expressions, fleeting moments where both host and guest seemed to be saying more with their eyes than their words. "You know, Scarlett," Colbert said, shifting forward in his chair with the kind of movement that suggested he was about to change direction, "I have to ask about something that's been making headlines recently. There's been quite a bit of discussion about your involvement with certain political causes, particularly your stance on various social issues." Johansson's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically, Stephen. I've always been vocal about issues I care about." "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," Colbert replied, his voice taking on a sharper edge that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Your recent comments about cancel culture, for instance, some people found them rather tone-deaf, considering your own controversies over the years." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Johansson's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the polished veneer of the typical late-night interview began to crack. "I think there's a difference between having a nuanced conversation about complex issues and being deliberately inflammatory." "For the sake of ratings, Stephen." "Inflammatory?" Colbert laughed, but it was a cold sound that had nothing to do with humor. "I prefer to think of it as asking the hard questions that others are afraid to ask. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about? Is that what this is?" Johansson shot back, her voice still controlled but with steel creeping into her tone. "Because I was under the impression I was here to discuss my film, not to be ambushed with loaded questions designed to create controversy." The audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far removed from the usual celebrity banter. Even the camera operators seemed to tense up, unsure whether to zoom in for the drama or pull back to capture the full scope of what was unfolding. Colbert leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "Ambushed? Scarlett, these are legitimate questions about your public statements. When you put yourself out there as a political voice, you open yourself up to scrutiny. Surely someone of your intelligence understands that." "Of course I understand that," Johansson replied, her voice rising slightly despite her obvious efforts to maintain composure. "What I don't understand is why you're choosing to distort my words and present them in the most negative light possible. That's not scrutiny, Stephen. That's gotcha journalism. And frankly, it's beneath you. Beneath me? Colbert's eyebrows shot up, and his voice took on a mocking tone that made several audience members visibly cringe. That's rich, coming from someone who's built a career on playing other people's stories, while staying suspiciously quiet about the real issues that matter. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Johansson's hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. Her breathing had become more shallow, and the careful mask of celebrity professionalism was beginning to slip away entirely. "Suspiciously quiet?" she repeated, her voice deadly calm in a way that anyone who knew her would recognize as a warning. Sign. Stephen, I've been an activist for over a decade. I've put my money, my time, and my reputation on the line for causes I believe in. What exactly are you accusing me of? I'm not accusing you of anything, Colbert replied with false sincerity that fooled absolutely no one in the room. I'm simply observing that for someone who claims to care so much about social justice, you seem to pick and choose your battles, very carefully, almost as if you're more concerned with protecting your brand than actually taking real risks. The words hit Johansson like a physical blow. Her composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped. She sat forward in her chair, her eyes blazing with an anger that transformed her entire demeanor from polished celebrity to fierce warrior. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You sit here in your comfortable chair, making millions of dollars to mock and tear down people who are actually trying to make a difference, and you have the audacity to question my commitment to the causes I believe in?" The studio fell into complete silence. Even the usually chattering audience was holding its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The carefully choreographed world of late-night television had given way to raw, unfiltered emotion, and nobody quite knew what would happen next. But this was just the beginning, and as both host and guest locked eyes across the desk, it became clear that the real fireworks were yet to come. Colbert's response came swift and cutting, his voice dripping with condescension, that made the studio lights seem to dim around them. "Oh, please, Scarlett, don't lecture me about making a difference when your idea of activism is posting carefully curated Instagram stories between your $100 million movie deals. At least I'm honest about what I do." The accusation struck like lightning, and Johansson's entire body language shifted into something predatory. She uncrossed her legs and planted both feet firmly on the ground, her posture straightening into a stance that suggested she was ready for war. "Honest? You want to talk about honesty, Stephen? Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on tearing down people who dare to have opinions different from yours, all while hiding behind the excuse of comedy." "That's what satire is," Colbert shot back, his own mask of civility beginning to crack. "It's holding a mirror up to society and showing people their hypocrisies, something you might understand if you spent less time in your Hollywood bubble and more time in the real world." The audience was now completely captivated by the verbal bloodbath unfolding before them. Several people had their phones out, clearly, recording what was rapidly becoming the most explosive late-night television moment in years. The show's producers, visible in the shadows beyond the stage lights, were frantically gesturing to each other, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation play out. "My Hollywood bubble?" Johansson's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Stephen, you've been living in your own bubble for so long that you've forgotten what actual journalism looks like. When was the last time you asked a real question instead of just setting up your next punchline? When was the last time you actually listened to a guest instead of just waiting for your turn to be clever?" The words hit their target with surgical precision. Colbert's face flushed red, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked genuinely rattled. "I've been doing this job for decades. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners. I don't need career advice from someone whose biggest political statement was playing a fictional spy in a comic book movie." "There it is," Johansson said, pointing directly at him with an accusatory finger that seemed to pierce through the television screen. The real Stephen Colbert, not the clever satirist, not the thoughtful interviewer, just another bitter man who can't stand it when someone challenges his narrative. The studio audience was now murmuring audibly, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The careful choreography of late-night television had completely broken down, replaced by raw, unfiltered animosity between two powerful figures who had clearly reached their breaking point. Colbert leaned forward, aggressively, his voice rising to match the intensity of the moment. "You want to see the real me, Scarlett? Fine. The real me is someone who's tired of privileged celebrities like you pretending to care about social issues while living lives of unimaginable luxury. The real me thinks it's obscene that you can make more money for a single movie than most people see in their entire lifetimes, and then have the nerve to lecture the rest of us about inequality." "And there's the truth," Johansson replied, her voice steady despite the fury blazing in her eyes. "You're not interested in social justice or holding people accountable. You're just jealous. Jealous that actors get paid more than talk show hosts. Jealous that we have platforms that reach beyond your little echo chamber. Jealous that when we speak, people actually listen, instead of just waiting for the next joke." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Colbert's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and something that looked dangerously close to humiliation. The audience was completely silent now, as if they instinctively understood that they were witnessing something that had crossed a line from entertainment into genuine personal warfare. "You think people listen to you?" Colbert's voice was low and venomous, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. "Scarlett, you're a product. A carefully manufactured, focus-grouped, market-tested product designed to sell movie tickets and magazine covers. The only reason anyone cares what you think about politics is because you're pretty and famous, not because you have anything intelligent to say." The words landed like physical blows, and for a moment Johansson looked genuinely stunned by the personal nature of the attack. But instead of backing down, something in her seemed to crystallize into pure determination. She stood up slowly, from her chair, her movement deliberate and commanding, instantly changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "I'm done," she said, her voice carrying a finality that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "I came here in good faith, to talk about my work, and instead you've decided to turn this into some kind of personal vendetta. I don't know what your problem is, Stephen, but I'm not going to sit here and be your punching bag for the sake of your ratings." But Colbert wasn't finished. As she began to remove her microphone, he pressed forward with the kind of reckless abandon that suggested he had completely lost control of the situation. "Running away? How typical. When the going gets tough, the Hollywood elite just walk away. Must be nice to have that option." Johansson froze, her hand still on the microphone. Clip. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath as she slowly turned back to face him, her expression transforming into something that made even the seasoned television crew take a step back. "What did you just say to me?" The question hung in the air like a sword poised to strike. Colbert, seemingly intoxicated by his own aggression, doubled down with a sneer that revealed just how far he had fallen from the professional standards expected of a late-night host. "You heard me perfectly well. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The moment someone calls you out on your privilege, you act like it's some kind of personal attack. Well, newsflash, Scarlett, sometimes the truth hurts." Johansson's eyes narrowed to slits, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made hardened directors and producers think twice about crossing her. "The truth? You want to talk about truth, Stephen? Here's some truth for you. I've spent the last 15 minutes watching you systematically try to destroy me on national television, not because I've done anything wrong, but because you needed a target for your own insecurities and failures as a host." She took a step closer to his desk, her presence now dominating the entire stage in a way that made Colbert visibly shrink back in his chair. "You talk about privilege? Let's examine your privilege, Stephen. You sit behind that desk every night, protected by a team of writers and producers, attacking people who don't have the same platform to defend themselves. You've turned cruelty into a brand, and somehow convinced yourself that makes you morally superior to the rest of us." The studio audience was completely transfixed. Several people were openly staring with their mouths agape, while others were whispering frantically to their companions. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming the most devastating takedown in late-night television history. Colbert tried to regain his footing, but his voice came out smaller than before, betraying his growing awareness that he had seriously miscalculated. "I'm not attacking you. I'm asking legitimate questions about your public positions." "Legitimate questions?" Johansson's laugh was sharp and incredulous. "Stephen, you haven't asked me a single legitimate question tonight. You've made accusations, you've twisted my words, and you've personally insulted me. That's not journalism. That's just bullying with better lighting." She gestured broadly at the studio around them, her movement encompassing the entire surreal scene. "And you know what the most pathetic part is? You think this makes you look good. You think your audience is going to applaud you for trying to humiliate me. But all you've done is reveal exactly who you really are, underneath all that fake charm and manufactured wit." The words hit Colbert like a physical assault. His face cycled through various shades of red as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. "I think you're being a little dramatic, Scarlett. This is just a normal interview." "Normal?" Johansson's voice rose to a level that made the entire studio feel the force of her anger. "Stephen, there is nothing normal about what you've done here tonight. You've ambushed me. You've made personal attacks, and you've shown a complete lack of professionalism that frankly shocks me. I've been doing interviews for 20 years, and I have never ever been treated with such disrespect." She began unhooking her microphone with deliberate movements, each action a statement of finality. "But here's what I want everyone watching to understand. This isn't about me. This is about a man who has so completely lost his way that he thinks destroying his guests is entertainment. This is about someone who has forgotten that there are real people on the other side of his jokes." Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, but his voice cracked under the pressure. "Scarlett, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of satirical interviewing. Sometimes we have to push boundaries to get to the truth." "The truth?" Johansson whirled around to face him one final time, and her expression was so fierce that even the camera operators took a step back. "The truth is that you're a coward, Stephen. You hide behind your desk and your writers and your carefully constructed persona, but when someone actually challenges you, when someone refuses to play your little game, you fall apart completely." She pulled the microphone completely free and set it down on his desk with a sharp click that echoed through the stunned silence of the studio. "The truth is that you've forgotten what it means to be a real interviewer, someone who actually cares about their guests and their stories. Instead, you've become a parasite, feeding off other people's discomfort for your own entertainment." The studio was now in complete chaos. Audience members were standing up, trying to get a better view of the unprecedented meltdown. The show's producers were visible in the wings, clearly panicking about how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Some were gesturing frantically at the cameras, while others were speaking rapidly into their headsets. Colbert, seemingly realizing that he had created a disaster of epic proportions, made one final, pathetic attempt to regain control. "Scarlett, maybe we should take a break and—" "No," she cut him off with a finality that brooked no argument. "We're not taking a break. We're done, Stephen. Completely and utterly done. And I want everyone watching to know that this is not what a professional interview looks like. This is what happens when a host forgets that their job is to serve their audience, not their own ego." She turned to address the audience directly, her voice carrying easily across the stunned studio. "I apologize to everyone who came here tonight expecting to see a real interview. You deserved better than this circus, and I'm sorry you had to witness it." With that, she walked toward the exit with her head held high, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march for Colbert's credibility. The host sat frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of shock and humiliation, as he watched his guest disappear into the wings. The studio remained in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Colbert stared at the spot where Johansson had been sitting, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he turned to the camera with a weak smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Well," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I guess we'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone in that studio knew the truth. There would be no coming back from this. The damage was done, the bridge was burned, and Stephen Colbert had just committed professional suicide on live television. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience began to file out in shocked silence, the only sound left was the clicking of Scarlett Johansson's heels, echoing down the hallway as she walked away from the wreckage of what had once been a career-defining interview, leaving behind only the smoking ruins of a host who had forgotten the most basic rule of television: never underestimate your guest.